Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, May 22nd, 2017. This is my free daily news and comment podcast, available on YouTube and all of my regular outlets. Donald Trump leaves the United States for the first time, a world tour to the Middle East. And while it does help him escape the heat of the various scandals that embroil his administration, he's, of course, generating new heat by partying with dictators and monarchists and by setting up a big arms deal so that the slaughter of innocent people in Yemen, with U.S.-made munitions largely directed by Saudi military units, will continue. And he also, I believe, is fanning the flames and really reopening wounds between Sunni and Shia Muslims. So there's some bizarre scenes. Maybe you've seen the photos of Trump doing some kind of a sword dance with the robed Saudi monarchs. And then there's that weird scene where they're opening this new center. It's to fight terrorism. I don't quite know what it is, but they threw a lot of money at it. And there you have Trump lined up with the King of Saudi Arabia and the maximum leader of Egypt, the ruthless military dictator El-Sisi. And they outstretch their hands to some lighted orb. It's a really weird, kind of a Ouija board or crystal ball setting. But when you go to Saudi Arabia, you do weird things. I mean, Obama had to change his travel plans to return for the death of the last king. And we've seen most American leaders holding hands with these guys, which has to make them feel really creepy. But Trump gave this speech, and he managed to stay on script for the most part. And in it, he told them that the U.S. is not going to solve the problems of the Middle East for you. And he abandoned any standard of human rights or other international standard for our foreign policy, saying, hey, you can do what you want. We just want to be partners in destroying the most virulent extremes of Islam. And as usual, Trump is oblivious to the contradictions that he presents and espouses, because on the one hand, he had these seemingly heartfelt comments about how there's been so much bloodshed and we've got to find peace in the Middle East. And he delivers $110 billion worth of American arms to the Saudis so they can continue the military carnage. And so it remains to be seen how all this is reported in the regional media and the extent to which the monarchs can dictate adulation for Trump. They certainly poured it on, and he loves to eat it up. But, of course, there are big gaps between the attitudes of the leaders of these countries and the populations that they suppress. And what's interesting, and many people have noted it, is that Iran held elections, and the so-called moderate in that particular orbit, Rouhani, won a second term. Now, Iran is hardly a free democracy. You can't get on the ballot if you're a liberal and if you don't have the approval of the supreme Ayatollah. But they did have an election. And Saudi Arabia has never had a national election. They have local councils, and people are picked by the royal family. So the contrasts, I think, are interesting. And we'll get some commentary on that in just a moment here. But the victory for Rouhani is an embrace of the U.S. Negotiated international deal over Iran's nuclear intentions. And it is ironic that that victory is offset by calls to demonize Iran and to separate the Shiites, largely led by Iran and Iraq, from the Sunnis. And, of course, that's, to me, a calculation that is very difficult for the U.S. to make and implement. And I think it will most likely fan the flames between Shia and Sunni. and they will continue to be united primarily in their hatred of the United States and the military occupations that we maintain on Islamic soil. So I turned to Juan Cole. He's a professor at the University of Michigan, and you can find his blog at juancole.com. He's a man I've been talking to for years. I have a high regard for his knowledge of the region, and while I don't agree with everything in the 2 essays that I'm linking to in the show file for today's podcast, I think that he has some really bright analysis that you should expose yourselves to. So he writes that while Trump and his cronies like Steve Bannon were hobnobbing with the Saudi monarchy just across the Persian Gulf there, the center-right Hassan Rouhani won a second term as president, even though he was opposed by the hardliners in that country. And like I did, Cole acknowledges that neither Saudi Arabia nor Iran is what you might call a democracy, but Iran does have a more flexible political system, while Saudi Arabia is arguably the world's last absolute monarchy. And he asks these rhetorical questions. Does the Saudi public really want the Yemen war? Well, we don't know, because polling of that sort is not permitted in the House of Saud and in their kingdom. So the other issue is that Cole writes, there's no freedom of the press. Critics of the Saudi government are routinely imprisoned. And by the way, Wilbur Ross, the Secretary of Commerce and one of Trump's billionaire buddies, noted in comments to the U.S. media, hey, there are no protesters in Saudi Arabia. Isn't this great? Yeah, Wilbur, somebody ought to tell him that anybody who protests is going to be flogged, if not jailed, for a long period of time. So back to Juan Cole, he says, not only has Saudi Arabia stood for absolutism at home, it is mobilized to destroy populist and democratic movements in the region. Arguably, it was a major force behind the derailing of the brief Egyptian experiment with parliamentary democracy, and it has suborned liberal Syrian revolutionaries into a fanatical Salafism that threatened the Alawite Shiites and other minorities in Syria. So I think this is an interesting piece, and I encourage you to read it, and I think you'll find commentary there that you're not going to hear in corporate media outlets. Another piece that Juan Cole published on May 22nd regarding Trump's speech that I referenced earlier. Well, Juan Cole says, I estimate that people of European Christian heritage polished off or killed as many as 100 million persons in the 20th century, and that Muslims may have killed 2 to 3 million. Well, that's an interesting scoreboard that you'll never hear in the corporate media in this country. Juan Cole says Trump seems to think that pumping $110 billion in shiny new weapons into a volatile Middle East will lead to peace. If there's any sure correlate of war, it is massive purchases by one regional power of new armaments. And, of course, this is America's biggest export now, and we are really invested in maintaining munitions manufacturing, and perpetual wars sure help to keep that market active and with demand for U.S. products. So he says for Trump to attack Iran, which had just had a popular election, from Saudi Arabia, an absolute monarchy where the populace have no rights, is weird. And he's right about that. It is weird. So as we look at that, it's going to be an interesting trip. The president got to Israel today, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But I want you to focus on this for a moment, because the seedy, sordid, transactional nature of Trump, his administration, and his own thinking is in sharp relief. Because Jared Kushner, the son-in-law, married to Ivanka, he was the point man who negotiated the terms of this $110 billion arms sale, and he even took restrictions off that Obama had imposed on previously approved arms sales because of the ugly operations of the Saudis in Yemen. So in reversing that, Kushner did some big favors for the Saudis, and with Donald taking human rights entirely out of the equation, well, it's just all transactional, right? So, would you be offended if the Saudis expressed their gratitude by agreeing with the UAE to donate $100 million to a World Bank fund that was the brainchild of Jared's wife, Ivanka Trump? Now, what kind of pillow talk did they have? Honey, I hear you're negotiating a big arms deal for the Saudis. Do you think that they'd kick back $100 million to my favorite fund at the World Bank that promotes women entrepreneurs? So we have this picture of Ivanka sitting down with these royal, I was going to call them ragheads, but I think that's too insulting. But these members of the Saudi royal family, she goes through the motions of saying how the rights of women in the Saudi kingdom are improving, and I don't know where you find any objective data to support that, but she paid lip service to the progress that is being made for women as she accepted or thanked them for this $100 million. So let's remember two things. That during the campaign, Donald Trump was attacking Hillary Clinton because the Clinton Foundation did accept millions of dollars from the Saudis. As I recall, it was between 10 and 20 million after Hillary signed off on a big arms deal back around 2010. And I was offended by that at the time. It's tawdry, and it appears to be illegal. But it happened. And now with this $100 million, the Trumps up the ante while they lower any ethical standards to almost make them disappear. But Trump on the campaign stump in an October debate said, Saudi Arabia giving $25 million to the Clinton Foundation, Qatar, all of these countries. You talk about women and women's rights. These are people who push gays off buildings. These are people that kill women and treat women horribly. And yet you take their money. As we know, Trump never listens to himself or reflects on what he said before, and consistency is just a kind of annoyance to a guy like him. And speaking of Hillary Clinton, her foundation, and the origins of the funds that were sent there, some of which I believe comprised a conflict of interest, I want to tip you off to an in-depth interview I'm releasing later today with a well-known feminist scholar, Professor Susan Bordeaux. And Bordeaux has just published a book called The Destruction of Hillary Clinton. And if you're a regular listener to this program, you know that I didn't support Hillary and that I offered honest criticism of her campaign, her positions on the issues, her history as Secretary of State and a U.S. Senator, and I did not vote for her last year. And when I shared that with Susan Bordeaux, it took her breath away. To imagine that a lefty like me wouldn't follow her in voting for such a flawed candidate as Hillary Clinton. Now, Bordeaux and I agree on a few things. That James Comey massively interfered with the election. That the media malpractice was over the top. And there are a few other areas where we agree. I was surprised when she told me she agreed about my critique of Hillary's advocacy for taking out Gaddafi in Libya. And we agreed that the Benghazi hearings were a useless witch hunt. But we also had some very sharp disagreements about the Clinton Foundation and other issues. Here's an excerpt from my in-depth interview with Professor Susan Bordeaux. While we're in media malpractice, I have to be even-handed. Rachel Maddow, I think, really soiled her reputation. And let me just offer one example. It was the Nevada caucuses, where one Bernie supporter picked up a chair and put it down. And that was seen as a chair-throwing incident. And Rachel depicted that with B-roll, file footage from a World Wrestling Federation event.
Well, that was definitely malpractice. But I will say that throughout the primary, Rachel was much kinder to Bernie than she was to Hillary, perhaps with that one exception. I mean, she was, her coverage was very clear to us Hillary supporters that she was, in her heart of hearts, a Bernie supporter. Not in the general, but in the primary. So yeah, she may have misdescribed that, but in general, I think she went out of her way to give Bernie really good coverage.
Well, I don't perceive it quite the same way. She did give him access, and I agree that when in the few examples, she only got access to Hillary a couple of times, that she, was balanced, and that included some critical questioning. You can hear the full interview with Professor Susan Bordeaux. It's available for my subscribers at peterbcollins.com, at iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker. Almost everywhere you find the podcast, except for YouTube. Only the free, unrestricted podcasts are shipped to YouTube. And all of this is made possible by my subscribers who get first crack at our in-depth interviews. People like Billy Cook, Dick Atlee, Jeff Stewart, and Terry Paris. They're all staunch supporters of this podcast, kicking in $5 or $10 a month, and you can join them. I don't want your Social Security money or your last $10, but if you've got some cash in the bank, and you'd like to support my work here, I'd very much appreciate it. Just drop by peterbcollins.com, find the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. That takes you to the sign-up page, and boom, you've got options to support this podcast. Now, speaking of the lowered standards of ethics of this Trump administration, there's a battle underway with the head of the Office of Government Ethics, Walter Schaub. And Schaub has contacted each cabinet department and asked them to submit copies of any waivers that were executed to allow lobbyists and lawyers who would be barred from working at a specific agency to nevertheless take a job there. And this is the enabler for the wrecking crew, people who come from the finance sector to the Treasury Department, people who are opposed to environmental regulations like Scott Pruitt being tapped to run the EPA. And, of course, there are many other people whose identities are not well known to the public. And many of these are lawyers and lobbyists, the parts of the swamp that Trump said he was going to drain. And the Trump administration is refusing to allow the Ethics Office to look at these waivers and to publish them. And Schaub, who's in the final year of a 5-year term, appears to be willing to go down fighting. So we'll see if he is successful. At least the transparency is, I think, a minimum requirement here. I don't believe those people belong in government service to begin with. So now Trump has arrived in Israel, and Benjamin Netanyahu rolled out the red carpet for him, despite the fact that members of his cabinet were squirming. Some were instructed to go to the airport to greet Trump, but they didn't want to go. Some complained that they weren't going to get a picture taken with him, so why should they bother? How venal can you be? Others were protesting the idea that Netanyahu wanted to extend a few tidbits to Trump to pretend that he's moving in the direction of some sort of meaningful negotiations with the Palestinians. So Netanyahu trotted out a couple of tchotchkes that he's already used before, including, minor changes in some of the transit rules and other things that really don't matter much to either side. But they're trying to put some things on paper to show Trump that they're responding to him. Now, he appears, Trump, determined to try to break through in some way. And while I have zero confidence in Trump, and while I believe that his approach, with an ambassador who's his former bankruptcy lawyer, who is a dyed-in-the-wool Zionist, and with Jared Kushner, the arms deal maker, who's also supposed to be the peacemaker between Israel and the Palestinians, nothing has surfaced to generate any confidence that Trump can pull this off. But if he can, I'll be there to watch and support where I can. But I don't expect too much. The hunger strike of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails has entered its 6th week, and Trump should expect to see quite a few protesters when he visits the West Bank and the Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas on Tuesday. And as I mentioned, there was some internal fighting in the Netanyahu cabinet. And let's see, this is right-wing politicians are disappointed that the Trump administration appears to be adhering to long-standard American policy regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And because Trump has backed off on moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which would have been a clear provocation, he has actually listened to cooler heads in this case. That's pretty unusual. So here are the tchotchkes I mentioned. The Israeli government approved for the Palestinians a West Bank industrial zone expansion, the phased extension of operating hours of the Allenby Bridge between the West Bank and Jordan, and some of these incentives are recycled. They have been offered but not accepted before. Oh, and there was a little brushback because on Sunday night there was a dinner hosted by the knuckle-dragging defense minister of Israel, Avigdor Lieberman. Actually, it was scheduled for tonight, but on Sunday they announced that it is being scrubbed. The guests were to include Secretary of State Rexon Tillerson, Ivanka, Jared, and I guess Trump himself. But the dinner is off, and we don't know why. The New York Times has identified the suspect who serves inside the Trump campaign, who has been asked by the House committee to submit to a voluntary interview and may be one of those persons of interest to the FBI. His name is Michael Caputo. He lives near Buffalo, New York. He spent 6 months on the Trump team last year, but he's worked in Russia in the past. He is tied to the Trump brains, Roger Stone. And if you haven't seen the Netflix documentary, I think it's called Get Me Roger Stone or Call Me Roger Stone, it's worth seeing. It's offensive, but it's information you need to know about how we ended up with Trump as a candidate to begin with. So Jackie Speer, who is a respected member of Congress, a Democrat from here in Northern California, she first asked about Caputo in the March 20 hearing with FBI Director Comey, and he does appear to be on a list of interview subjects. I don't know if it's fair to call them suspects yet. We've just learned in a revelation on the front page Sunday New York Times that the U.S. spies suffered a huge setback during the Obama administration, and they kept it under wraps until now. But starting in 2010, the Chinese government systematically dismantled CIA spying operations, killing or imprisoning more than a dozen sources. At least a dozen people were killed. 3 of them were shot, one in front of his colleagues in the courtyard of a government building. Others were put in jail, and all told, the Chinese killed or imprisoned 18 to 20 of the CIA's sources in China. And I don't know why this is just coming to light now. This is another story that's based exclusively on anonymous sources. And while I don't dispute the accuracy of this, it's part of a really troubling pattern of these fact-free reports where we can't cite a source, we don't know the validity of the information, there are no documents to support this, and here we go again. It's very clear that the Trump team and the Republicans in general want to try to shrink Obamacare to where they can drown it in a proverbial bathtub. And it's clear that they're using passive-aggressive tactics to undermine the financial markets, the insurance markets that are required to make Obamacare work so they can say, see, it doesn't work. So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy that they're pursuing right now. And in the Sunday New York Times, Robert Pear has a story where the headline reads, "What ails health market is largely Washington." The Trump administration and Congress are rattling the markets, he says. The administration's refusal to guarantee payment of subsidies to health insurance companies makes the outlook for the Affordable Care Act murky, and it does really threaten imminent collapse. We're seeing insurers pull out for next year. Others are jacking up prices, and the uncertainty is being enhanced because the Trump administration has asked a federal appeals court for an additional delay of 90 days on a lawsuit that relates to the issue of paying subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. And you pull the subsidies, and most of the people who are getting that insurance, or at least a large portion of them, can't afford it, and they're going to drop out, and the whole scheme will collapse. Nancy Pelosi's got it right. In delaying their suit, Republicans cynically continue to sow uncertainty in the health coverage of millions of Americans. At a critical period when insurers are deciding premiums for next year, Republicans are pouring uncertainty into the health insurance marketplace. And I think that it's going to work, unfortunately. And I think that means that the death panels that Sarah Palin told us about back in 2008 are filled with Republicans who want to kill Obamacare. For a long time now, I've argued that building a wall on the southern border and these other crazy ideas to try to stem so-called illegal immigration are pointless because a large portion of the undocumented immigrant population in this country are people who came in at airports on a visa and then never went home. So the fine folks at Homeland Security, for only the second time in 20 years, despite a law that requires them to give us information every year, they tracked overstays by citizens of countries that require a visa. And the number is lower than I expected. 629,000 people at the end of 2016 were considered to have overstayed a visa last year. So that is a little bit surprising. But if you add that up year after year after year, then the cumulative number can reach easily into the millions and become a significant portion of the estimated 11 or 12 million undocumented residents of the United States today. The highest rates came from countries outside of the visa waiver program. 13% of visitors from Afghanistan overstayed, 11% from Iraq, and European countries have numbers down in the 1% range. And again, that comes as a surprise to me. A couple of quick items about two loathsome bills. First, loathsome bills. I can't even say it. Loathsome Bill Cosby, who is facing a trial in Pittsburgh. The venue shifted from Philadelphia because of all the pretrial publicity. I think it's hard to find jurors who don't already have an opinion about Bill Cosby almost anywhere in the country. But the jury selection is starting today in the Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh. And the other loathsome bill, O'Reilly, appears to have job offers dangling from Newsmax, from Herring Networks. They have the One America News Network that I've seen a couple of times. It leans conservative and pretends not to. And Sinclair Broadcast Group, which is the largest TV station ownership cabal, and they are going to become even larger with the acquisition of Tribune Media. And Sinclair is considered a likely potential landing spot for Bill O'Reilly. And we shall see how all that plays out. Julian Assange has said that for now he's staying at the Embassy of Ecuador in London because the British still have a warrant for his refusal to surrender in the past, a charge much below the extradition request from Sweden on sex charges that have now been dropped. But Assange knows that the U.S. wants him, and he is being extremely cautious. The New York Times published an editorial, very lukewarm support for WikiLeaks and Assange in the last couple of days. And here's the last paragraph. Has Assange violated American law? Nobody claims that he stole the classified information that he published, and in publishing it, he did what the New York Times and other mainstream publications have done. The Obama-era Justice Department presented evidence against Assange to a grand jury, but no charges were brought. So Assange would probably stand a chance of being acquitted if charged. The other possibility is for the Justice Department to file charges and seek Assange's extradition. That would provide an element of clarity in a saga that has gone on far too long. They don't conclude with a powerful defense of the right of WikiLeaks to publish. And given that the New York Times is one of the mainstream outlets that has benefited from publishing the product of WikiLeaks, I find that hypocritical and disappointing. Turning the tables, the Erdogan government in Turkey is protesting the actions of the security detail provided by the United States during Erdogan's visit to Washington last week, where Erdogan looked on as his security goons started to kick and beat and disperse American protesters at the Turkish embassy in Washington. I guess he figures, Trump creates his own reality, so Erdogan gets to do it too. The divide in the Democratic Party continues, evidenced by a contentious convention for the state party here in California over the weekend. And Eric Bauman, a guy I've known, worked on a couple of campaigns with, he's an establishment Democrat from Los Angeles. He won the chairmanship, but by only 62 votes. And his progressive challenger, Kimberly Ellis, who is a staunch Bernie supporter, she is not accepting the outcome. And while the party rules don't really have a system for recount or any provision for that, the party leaders have agreed to an audit, and we'll see where that goes. And finally, today, at the Notre Dame graduation over the weekend, a bunch of graduates did the right thing. Mike Pence, the vice president, was the commencement speaker, and when he began to talk, they got up and walked out. That's the kind of demonstration, that's the kind of rejection that I approve of. But earlier this month at the University of Buffalo, students jeered and basically drowned out Robert Spencer, a conservative author and a blogger who espouses a dark view of Islam. Now, I don't believe that he should have been invited in the first place, but it wasn't my call. And I believe that by heckling him and not permitting him to speak, they violate his First Amendment rights, they trivialize the right to free speech, and they create a martyr out of an idiot. I am a pretty extreme defender of the First Amendment in all cases. Thanks for joining me for my news and comment podcast today. You can always respond to me by email, peter@peterbcollins.com.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling